The Seljuks are arguably the most underrated and one of the least known empires out there. While some people argue that the Seljuks were Persianized, others claim that it was Turkish through and through. Some say they brought destruction, others say they brought prosperity. I didn't know any of it, so I bought a book and read about it in The Great Seljuk Empire by A.C.S. Peacock, a British historian with a PhD in Oriental Studies from Cambridge University. Now, of course, I can't present everything within the book here, but I would like to show some of the more interesting aspects to give you an idea about the Seljuk Empire. First things first, we know incredibly little about the Seljuks, partially because many Seljuk cities were destroyed by, for instance, conquest, Mongol conquest, deserted due to famine, or built over. So there is very little archaeological investigation possible. The main source for Seljuk history comes from literary sources. As an example, the single most important Seljuk chronicles were written by the Arabic Nusrat al-Fatra by Imad al-Din al-Isfani, Saladin's secretary, and Saladin is a very interesting figure with respect to the Seljuks here, which I will come later, and this work was composed in Syria. The other important sources are Al-Mutazzam fil Tariq around 1200, by the Hanbali scholar Ibn al-Yafzi from Baghdad, which was about politics and sometimes daily life in Baghdad. Anything else was briefly featured in his work. And there's also Ibn al-Yafzi's grandson, Sibit bin al-Yafzi, which had a more broader work and was written in 1256. If you're interested in Turkic history, you might have noticed that these works appear decades after the fall of the Seljuks. The last work about 50 to 60 years after the Seljuks disappear. And the reason for that is that the Seljuks didn't bother writing down their own history. In this particular case, it wasn't the conqueror writing history, but the conquered. In short, the reconstruction of Seljuk history is done by 13th century sources, without which the reconstruction of history would not be possible at all. Now, this in itself wouldn't be as much of an issue, but these works were often done with a bias in mind or had other intentions. Often, the writers themselves viewed the Seljuks with contempt or disgust. Hence, the recorded history is not necessarily the reflection of the real history. Lastly, there is a huge language problem historians are facing. Seljuk research does not only require Turkish knowledge for secondary sources, but also Arabic and Persian for the primary ones. As a result, there is very little incentive to research about the Seljuks outside of Turkey, that is. That being said, who were the Seljuk Turks? Similar to the history of the Seljuks, their origins are also clouded with a lack of documented sources, but generally speaking, historians agree that they were most likely a splinter group of the Khazar Turks. They seem to have been living as nomads at the Khazar border region and splitted away from them later on. It's also likely that the Seljuks were initially Jews before they mass converted with other Turkic groups to Islam. A lot of Turks at that time also converted to Christianity, like the Karaites, and to Judaism, like the Khazar, but most converted to Islam. The details of this conversion are not clear, but the conversion to Islam has happened through conviction rather than force. When a head of a clan converted, tens of thousands of households followed. As much as the origins were obscured, the Turks were however not unknown to Muslims. Since the 9th century, Turks were deployed as elite soldiers by the Abbasid Caliphate and later on the Mamluks. The reason for that was simple: Turks were seen as profound soldiers, in fact, the best out there. Christian writers described the Turks as invincible fighters and as God's wrath. Muslims knew about them longer and of course their origin, but still viewed them as top-notch warriors. Ibn Hasul even wrote a book on, quote, on the superiority of Turks, which is filled with praise. In particular, the Turks were known as excellent bowmen. Sanjar, a Seljuk ruler, even boasted in his letter to the Karakitai ruler that his Turkish soldiers could split a hair with their arrow. Turkish military prowess was even known as, quote, fighting in the Turkish style, but it is unclear today what this entitled. Although the Turks were known as excellent warriors, Turks were not professional warriors per se. They were good in martial arts not because they wanted to be deployed as professional soldiers, but because it was part of the way they lived. Except women and children, all Turks were expected to fight for their respective family, clan, or nation. This mindset is still part of Turkish identity, and as a Turk from Turkey, you most definitely heard the term, every Turk is born a warrior. Rabbi Benjamin of Tudela described the Turks as, they, Jews of Kursan, are in league with the Kofar al-Turk, who worship the wind and live in the wilderness, and do not eat bread, nor drink wine, but live on raw, uncooked meat. They eat animals both clean and unclean, and they are friendly towards the Israelites. He also included in his book that Turks have no noses. To sum it up in a nutshell and to give a final example, Turks had a certain prestige. Al-Muqtadi and Al-Muqtafi were, for instance, banned by a Seljuk Sultan from purchasing Turkish slaves, while Muqtafi was still allowed to purchase Greeks and Armenians for his militia, since these warriors were considered very definitely second best and not a serious military threat.
Sperm, you are weak sperm. This is the strong sperm. This is the Greek god. Okay, Greek god. If you have Greek god, you won't have win, but you lose.
Interesting to note, even though Turks underlined their kinship, tribalism was less present among Turks than among Arabs. The Seljuk rulers in particular adopted Arabic names next to their Turkish ones in order to legitimize their rule, meaning they had two names, one Turkish, one Arabic. The search of justifying the origin appeared to have been the case in the 13th century after the fall of the Seljuks. The Seljuks were more based on merit, weird merit, which I will come to speak of as well, but not at this part of the video. Interesting to note number 2. The Ashina clan was regarded of the highest status by the Seljuk Turks. It was believed that sovereignty was the birthright of the Ashina clan and that they descended from a wolf. The Seljuks did not claim to be part of this. That being said, what was the initial and general perception of Turks, aside from being warriors? At first, the early Seljuk conquest was perceived as divine punishment by the Christians, as described by the Armenian historian Aristarchus Lastivertsi. Ganzavit historian Bayhaqi, on the other hand, described the Turks as a pest that do, quote, damage wherever they go. Main reason for this type of perception was because the Turks lived and died by their flock. Their sheep often numbered 100,000s, so Turkish presence was intertwined with animals eating the countryside empty. A 3,000 strong Turkish army, for instance, had a sheep herd of 300,000. This number is claimed, so take it with a grain of salt, but you get the idea. Of course, the degree of this changed based on the number of Turks going from A to B, but the Seljuk conquest in particular was associated with an enormous number of animals. This perception, however, changed later on. Armenian chronicler Matthew of Edessa described the third Seljuk Sultan during the campaign against the Romans as, quote, "This Sultan's heart was filled with benevolence, gentleness, and compassion for the Christians. He showed fatherly affection for all the inhabitants of the lands he traversed, and so gained control of many towns and regions without resistance." The perception, but you get a rough idea what the Seljuk Turks were, why people had a bias towards them, and why negative, but also the legendary reputation that followed the Seljuk Turks. The reputation and perception, of course, lived and died by their actions, in particular with the Seljuk conquest westwards, but since the Seljuks fought and battled many different groups, the length and details of which I cannot do justice in this video, I would rather give you a rough idea who the Seljuks fought. The infighting looks like this: Fatimids supporting rebellions against the Seljuks, Turkmens versus Seljuks, Atabey Amirs versus Seljuks, Ismailids versus Seljuks. Side note, the Ismailids are the assassins, the Shia assassins from Assassin's Creed. They were basically ignored since they were only controlling fortifications which didn't really affect the state. They were also blamed for assassinations the Seljuks themselves conducted, so they were seen as a useful tool and were deliberately kept alive. There were other bordering nations that fought the Seljuks, other bordering nations supporting pretenders against the main Seljuk dynasty, Caliphate versus the Seljuks versus the Seljuks, part of the population versus the other part of the population. In short, it was a battle royale. Anyways, the question remains, why did the Seljuks decide to conquer and move westwards? This is actually a funny story because the Seljuks didn't want to conquer anything. For whatever reason, the Seljuks had to migrate. Some theories about the migration consider climate change to be the reason. Others say that there was a shortage of pasture land for the Seljuks. Some talked about mass migration, which didn't happen in Central Asia at that time, so it's anyone's guess why the Seljuks decided to move. Whatever the reason was, allegedly 300,000 households under the Seljuks started to move. Again, allegedly, take it with a grain of salt. Moving southwards, the Seljuks encountered the Ganzavids, a massive empire that was founded by former Turkic slave soldiers. The encounter did not result in a war, but a diplomatic approach by the Seljuks. Initially, the Seljuks wanted the towns of Sarks, Abivard and Merv to be subject to them, where the Seljuks would be implemented as overlords that would protect the region for the Ganzavids. This of course didn't go well with the Ganzavids and things escalated to a war. And before I move on with the war itself, I would like to underline an important fact here. The Seljuks did not want to be kings, they wanted land to feed their flock, which will further be underlined by the fact that even after the conquest of the Ganzavits, the Seljuks did not settle down but keep up their nomadic traditions. Either way, despite the overwhelming numeric advantage the Ganzavits had, the Seljuks had one massive advantage. They consisted of a strong quasi-quote-unquote elite force that was highly mobile. So while the Ganzavits had to thin out their forces in order to protect all border towns, the Seljuk could decide the place of the battle and with a local numeric superiority. The military capabilities and the mobility of the Seljuks turned out to be more than the Ganzavits could chew, and the war resulted in a decisive Seljuk victory. Cities in eastern Iran and Afghanistan, basically this region, fell due to the utter destruction of the Ganzavit forces, and the Seljuks continued to move westwards. The events were followed with contrary reports. Some claimed that the Seljuk conquest brought utter destruction for various reasons, but I'm using the word destruction very loosely here. Others claimed that it brought large stability. Most likely both happened depending on the region. However, the reports talking about the destruction blamed the entire blame on the Seljuks and disregarded the economic impact of the Ganzavit forces. Whatever the case was, the Iranian plateau was largely conquered through diplomacy. Without the Ganzavit forces, cities of the Iranian plateau surrendered one after the other. For the respective cities, this meant that nothing changed for them other than the ruler they had to pay a tribute to. Further expansion followed into Irakia, or in short, Iraq, which was more of a reference to western Iran, eastern modern-day Iraq. Yet even there, the intention was not occupation. After the conquest of the Iraq, the area was neither garrisoned nor was any significant force left behind. A few strongholds were occupied, but mainly used as temporary bases. A similar conquest followed into the Caucasus under Alparslan, and even though he claimed that it was a jihad, there are various theories about the actual reason. Sources mention the Navkia with Erbash Khan as the leader to be an issue and to be operating in the area. Others claim that it was more for pasture land, and some other sources point out that there was an increase of Turkmen migrating in the 12th century, which forced the Seljuks to find more and new pasture land westwards. Most likely all factors played a role, including the jihad. With respect to the religiousness of the various sultans, there are conflicting sources. David Duran Gudey said, "There is no doubt as the sincerity of religious feelings that led them to fund these religious buildings." He's not talking about the conquest, but about the Seljuks financing religious buildings. Ibn al-Dim, historian from Aleppo, said Alp Arslan had uncontrollable drunkenness, which was described during the siege of the native city. Interesting to note, there was no attempt to convert Armenians and Georgians. One king, King of Artsartan, was forced, but aside from that, no one was forced to convert to Islam. Either way, at this point in time, the Seljuks marched from the Central Asian steppes all the way to the Caucasus and Mesopotamia. In every war, they accidentally founded an empire while being concerned about empty sheep stomachs. From demanding some border cities, the Seljuks accidentally crushed their opponents so hard that they became the largest Islamic empire at that time. Now, some might have been eager to think that the Seljuks started to long for more, but this didn't happen. The Seljuks were content with moving around with their flocks. Of course, there were internal and external struggles with all kinds of groups, but overall there was no intention for further expansion and conflict. Until the Navaikir under Erbash Khan went to the Romans. Again, it's unclear who this group was and why the Seljuks were concerned or why the Romans even accepted them, but for whatever reasons, Byzantine offered them shelter. Maybe they believed they could be used against other Turkmens, maybe they wanted to use them as a bargaining chip. Whatever the case was, a demand to hand them over followed by the Seljuks, which was rejected by the Romans. This of course led to war, culminating in the decisive Seljuk victory in the Battle of Manzikert and the Turkification of Anatolia. However, this was most definitely not inspired by Seljuk conquests, and both Byzantine and Muslim sources agree Alp Arslan offered Romanos generous peace terms, involving merely the concession of a few frontier fortresses before the Battle of Manzikert even occurred. Whatever the reasons were, the crushing defeat at Manzikert left a power vacuum in the Byzantine Empire, which was followed by a civil war. This particular civil war was the reason why Anatolia was Turkified. The Seljuks left the area and concerned themselves with their sheep, when more and more Turkmen, on their own free will, moved unopposed into Anatolia. With an empire similar in size of the Roman Empire of antiquity, unopposed and content with life, the Seljuks started to think, what should we do with all of this land, power, and wealth? Introducing the Seljuk political structure.